This example shows an aortic valve with some structures attached to it. The movement of the cusps are not impaired. They are in the aortic side of the valve, not in the ventricular side. Since they are small, there are no chaotic movements. If this patient comes with a history of fever for 1 month, we would say these are vegetations. But if this patient has no fever or clinical suspicion of endocarditis, we will diagnose here degenerative valvar disease with calcifications. Notice that there is no way to differentiate if it is vegetations or calcium. The only way to do it is using M mode. If it is calcification, a calcified valve in M mode echo is very characteristic. It shows several well-defined lines with perfect line borders. It doesn't matter if it is just a tiny small calcification. It will have the same aspect of perfect lines with perfect smooth borders. This is a very important sign. The same thing happens with local thickening of the valve. If it is due to rheumatic or degenerative disease, it will show a single or multiple lines with perfect borders, and here too. A vegetation of endocarditis will have an internal structure appearance at M mode that looks like a cloud or cotton. There are none or poorly defined internal lines. It looks like a smudge. This is the aspect of ragged or serrated torn paper sign. Just take a newspaper and look at its edge. That's how a border of a vegetation, no matter if big or small, looks like. Always remember that small vegetations may not be identified on 2D echo, but is perfectly seen on M mode. The big ones, everyone makes the diagnosis if there is clinical suspicion. But in a patient with high suspicion of endocarditis and the 2D echo doesn't show a vegetation, we have to sweep slowly all the valves with M mode, and we may find these characteristic and diagnostic signs of a vegetation. Here an example: infective endocarditis in the mitral valve and in the septal wall, probably in a false tendon. Look at the characteristic findings here at the valve. Notice that there are no lines here or in there. Instead of lines, there is a smudge. Look at this aspect, like a cotton or a cloud. You see no lines. Look at the torn paper border. This is a classical aspect on M mode. This aspect doesn't happen in calcified or just thickened valve with no vegetation, unless there are also vegetations. Look at this aortic valve. 2D echo normal, no vegetations seen in a patient with clinical suspicion of endocarditis. A throughout M mode scan of all valves was performed. The aortic valve presented classical torn paper sign. This here may look like a smudge, but it's too thin to be sure. Watch the border of the same valve where there is no vegetation, how it is smooth. Completely different from what we see here at the vegetation. Another example: apical 4 chambers view of a biological prosthetic mitral valve in a patient with endocarditis suspicion. 2D echo non-diagnostic of vegetations. M mode shows some thickening due to calcification. See how these echoes are formed by lines with smooth borders, classical of calcium or plain thickening. But not here. This is torn paper sign of a vegetation. Notice that it is not a large vibration as seen when the leaflet is just ruptured. This patient had infective endocarditis of the aortic valve and a large vegetation prolapsing to left ventricle outflow tract. Here, the enlarged view of the vegetation. Notice first the torn paper sign, well seen in all moment, and the smudge. There are no lines in here, only this cloud, which is characteristic of vegetation. Mitral valve with ruptured cardi and vegetation. Look at the erratic, chaotic movement of the ruptured cardi. It's a gross movement, different from the fine, sharp movement of the torn paper also seen in the enlarged view. Notice that there are no lines inside the smudge. Look at this patient. It looks a calcified rheumatic aortic and mitral valve. Now let's aim the cursor to the left ventricular outflow reaching the aorta and base of the mitral valve. What we see is this well delineated border of the echo from the base of the mitral valve and a large vegetation with its smudge appearance that we did not identify by 2D echo because we thought it was a calcification in the aortic valve and not a large vegetation, well demonstrated by the mode. See also the torn paper sign. Look at the mitral valve, the anterior and posterior leaflet. Notice this vegetation attached to the anterior leaflet. No lines typical of calcium, but a smudge and a ragged, torn paper appearance of a vegetation. Now pay attention to the aortic valve. Is there any doubt that it's heavily calcified? Now, the M mode of the valve. Is it calcified? Absolutely not. That is a huge vegetation. 2D echo cannot differentiate it. For the M mode, it is very easy. See the smudge aspect. No characteristic lines with clear border as seen in calcifications. Watch this M mode of a calcified mitral stenosis. There are lines here from calcium, but also regions where you see no perfect lines, but the smudge in certain places and also torn paper sign. So there is endocarditis. These signs have to be searched for with M mode. You have to scan the beam everywhere at the valve looking for them. They will be seen only where there is a vegetation. Most of the valve may be normal. Here I cannot say there is a vegetation since it is formed by lines, but not there. One more case of heavily calcified mitral stenosis. But look here, there is also vegetation in this valve. In this location you see obvious aspect of calcification with clear-cut lines, but in the same valve there are smudge and ragged torn paper signs of vegetations.